My name is Jeff Stackhouse. I work for UC Cooperative Extension up in Eureka, California. I was asked today to speak a little bit about smoke management around pile burning, and I would just want to give kind of a brief overview of California air quality regulations for the open burner, because sometimes it's a little blurry as to where the lines are and who gets to do what where. So bear with me as we explain throughout this talk. The first piece is where or what permits required in the state as a burner. And essentially, you're required to have air quality permits in the entire state around how your smoke is managed. It varies a little bit on size and scope and materials and other things, which we'll get into in this talk. But I also wanted to point out that burn permits for the flame itself are also required for most of the state, most of the year. In the southern part of the state, permits are required for, burn permits are required year round. In the northern part of the state, where it's kind of a red dotted line, permits are required during the declared fire season. So essentially, they're not required in the winter from an agency like CAL FIRE, but they are required during the summer and any other time of year when wildfire poses a risk. So I like to equate, when we're talking about smoke management, I like to describe it as, kind of like, what do you do with the ice that's in the, that's in the bottom of your cup when you have a to-go cup? If you're in downtown LA and bumping into people shoulder to shoulder, you kind of got to be careful when you take the lid off and you go to throw it, because you don't want to hit somebody in the face. You don't want to, create a slipping hazard in the subway, for example, or whatever it may be. You get the idea. Where if you're in the middle of nowhere in Nevada or out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean or something, you could pretty much throw that ice wherever you want and it's not going to cause a problem, right? So it's only a problem if it lands somewhere it's not supposed to, and your smoke's the same way. So the pros and cons of air quality regulations in this state, the biggest pro, as someone that lives here, is that we have great air and it's clean air whenever we don't have wildfires for the most part. The other nice thing about the air quality management in terms of, regulatory process is that it's locally controlled within regions, air districts or air basins, and that those boards that govern those air districts are locally influenced, typically with elected officials serving on those boards. So people within those districts have the opportunity afforded to them to go and have conversations to see things changed if they so desire, as long as it falls within the federal and state laws. The cons of air districts across the state is that there's irregular expectations. There's kind of the blanket of the state and federal laws that you're required to abide by, but each air district can be more constrained, more constrictive of open burning as they desire. The other piece that's a little frustrating and challenging across the state, both as a burner and as someone who communicates with the air districts quite a bit, is the irregular funding, for air districts in terms of their staff time. So some air districts have to charge quite a bit for their fees to be able to pay for the programming, where other districts are supplemented by the county or by state budgets. So in general, where do these rules come from? So the federal EPA mandates basically particulate matter 2.5, which is a size of smoke particle that's dangerous to humans, I guess. I don't know much about the science, to be honest. But particles 2.5 are discussed frequently within the smoke crowd. And essentially, there's these standards where we're not allowed to go above a certain threshold, and that there are these federal reference monitor systems. So basically these air quality management or air quality monitors across the landscape, and attached is a map you can see here, and kind of makes sense. The areas with a lot of people have a lot of monitors. The other thing you'll notice is maybe that there's some interesting places in the like Southern Sierras where you're like, oh shoot, there's a lot of monitors there. What's going on? And what it is basically is that in California, we also have these like regional haze plans, which is to protect the visibility in national parks. So Yosemite, as you can see, has a lot of these FRMs in near proximity where there's going to be a lot of visitation based upon the view shed. The other piece to note is that the large area in Northern California where there aren't a lot of these FRMs is there is no data. So we don't know when we're over the thresholds or not in a lot of these rural areas. So in the West, management is often done via nuisance smoke complaints. So a neighbor complains because they're getting smoked out and the air district then knows that there's a problem, right? So it's kind of interesting to understand or begin to at least grasp an understanding of the state and how it's managed in terms of its air quality. The other thing to note is that some states primarily in the Southwest or Southeast, have right to burn laws that address nuisance smoke that's unrelated to human health, covered under the federal EPA standards. And that would be things like ash falling from the sky into someone's pool or onto their clothes, hanging on a clothesline, etc. So that doesn't apply to us here. So all things coming from our smoke, whether ash or particulate 2.5s, we have to own as burners emitting those things into the atmosphere. Okay, so we can recognize that we're not allowed to put smoke in some areas. We have these things called sensitive receptors, which are things like schools, airports, highways. If you're in close proximity to a highway, you don't want to obstruct the visibility of vehicles. So when you want to burn somewhere like Fortuna, California, for example, where I live, you can see that there's an airport in the south end of town, there's a college north of us, and then each of these towns themselves have schools, and Fortuna has a hospital, for example. So all of these things are what we would identify as sensitive receptors, places we don't want the smoke to go. So how do we manage where our smoke goes, and how do we avoid these sensitive receptors? So the first thing is to understand what weather conditions make for bad smoky conditions, right? So something that we look for as burners is an unstable atmosphere. And those are typically going to be identified as burn days within your air district. And there's visual indicators. The one that we're looking for is the fact that the smoke is going straight up and out, right? So we call that good dispersion. But you have big fluffy clouds, you'll have whirlwinds, gusty winds, and generally good visibility. So those are the visual signs that a layman's going to see of an unstable atmosphere. And these are often the conditions that create some of our really nasty wildfires in the summer as well. You think about the lightning and dry lightning and things like that. Those are signs of very unstable atmospheres. So then there's the flip coin of that, which is a stable atmosphere, right? And these are the days that, especially in the high mountains, we're going to see no burn day status from our air districts. And visual indicators of that: Central Valley, you're going to see low tule fog. The high mountains, particularly first thing early in the morning on a nice, clear, crisp winter day when everything has frost, you'll see the smoke coming out of people's chimneys and then just laying right across the mountain meadows or the mountain valleys. Anybody that's spent much time in rural California or anywhere really in the West has seen that. And then another thing is it's typically light and steady winds. But you'll see these clouds forming in layers, and the smoke will lift to different layers. And oftentimes you'll get better lift during the middle of the day, and then overnight hours, it will, drop back down and push your smoke down into places that are valleys, which are also common places of building homes where people live. So these are things we want to avoid. So we talk about smoke management. This term bounces around a little bit. And then there's burn plans, which is how you're going to actually conduct the act of burning. If it's a pile, you're going to have some sort of an edge around it that's non-flammable materials. It's going to be some distance away from a house or infrastructure you don't want to burn. most of the time in pile burning, the burn plan is in our head. We want to burn the pile, have all the material disappear, move on. For broadcast burns, it's often a little more complicated, but whether it's written down or not, generally it's good to think as a burner about our smoke and where we want it to go. And if it is written down in a burn plan, smoke management should be part of that burn plan. So depending on where you are in the state with the air districts, you're going to be asked to submit a smoke management plan based on the size of your project. And they may ask that it be submitted through a online system called PFERS, where you would get on an interactive mapping system, drop a point on a map, say what you're going to burn, or it could be submitted via hard copy to the air districts, depending on your air district. So on the North Coast, we are still submitting hard copies, but are likely to make the transition to PFERS in the coming years. Then the other piece to recognize is that, again, if you have very small projects or are in some of the more lenient air districts, you may not need to submit anything to the air district. So we'll get into the details of that in a little bit. But getting into what a smoke management plan is. So there's smoke management, and then there's like a formal document that is, this is my plan of how I'm going to manage smoke. So if you're going to get into the formal document and start writing things down, these are some of the things that are very commonly listed. So one is who's doing the burning and how do I get a hold of that person? Pretty standard. Whenever you get a permit, you typically want your name on it so you can prove that it's yours, not someone else's, right? The other thing is the type and quantity of material to be burned, whether it's leaves in a pile or whether it's a slash pile from logging, what have you. The other piece is a map of the project area is commonly added. So this is the area where my piles are, this is the geographic footprint of 100 piles, or, this is my broadcast burn that's going to be 12 acres, what have you. And with that, something that isn't listed all the time that I highly recommend to add if you are going to go through the trouble of making a smoke management plan is to have any project notes that are specific to that project. So in the lower right, I have a picture of smoke on a burn that I conducted last winter, right against power lines that has the potential to arc to the ground and injure either igniters or cause problems for PG&E or what have you. So that's something I would want to have in my map, draw it in and show it to the air district as something that they wouldn't necessarily know exists on that piece of property or is a limiting factor of that burn and where we want to send our smoke, for example, right? Another one could be your neighbor down the road has long COVID or something and has lung issues, and you don't want smoke to go in that direction because of that one sensitive receptor whom the air board wouldn't know lived in that specific house. Another great example, say your neighbors have bees, and and anyone that's been around bees understands that they don't do well in smoke, which is why we use smoke as we're checking bees and managing bees to tame them down so they don't sting us. But that being said, if you're burning in an area that has a commercial bee population and those bees are leaving the hive first thing in the morning, and then you put smoke out there that's going to persist throughout the day and into the dark, those bees can no longer make it back to their colonies to be safe at night, and it's a significant loss to that operator. So little things like that the air district wouldn't know about that are, little particulars of your specific project are great things to note in your map or somewhere in this plan. The other thing I showed already was the range ring, which is a set buffer around your site, identifying what sensitive receptors exist within 5-10 miles, whatever the air district likes. Those are often handy. And then not required by all districts, but required by some is quantifying the particulate emissions into the airshed. So not just how many tons of material do you have, but how many tons of smoke particles are you going to produce from that material? And there's some handy calculators I'll show you. Again, for the bigger projects, you're going to want to look at the weather and what your weather prescriptions are, most notably the wind direction. And I would argue that even if you're burning a 4x4 pile in your backyard, you don't want to put that into your home or into your neighbor's home on accident. So just to be slightly mindful of where your smoke's going to go before you even light a small project is useful. And then the last piece is a notification list, calling, local volunteer fire departments, maybe dispatch for bigger burns, your immediate neighbors, anyone that you think may be worried or, sensitive about seeing smoke in the air. And then the last piece is what is your action going to be if conditions change and your smoke starts misbehaving? So if it's forecasted to be a northwest wind and all of a sudden it's a south wind and it's blowing straight to a school, what are you going to do? So the most common minimum step of this would be to cease ignitions, stop lighting things on fire if it's going the wrong direction. You don't need to add to the already existing problem. And then if you have the ability to put the fire out, that would be kind of the best, scenario all in all, is to stop all emissions. So that being said, it kind of depends, right? Smoke management plans depend on the size of your project, the material you're burning, and where you're located in the world. Burning some little jackpot piles in the spring on an open prairie is going to be very different than burning, timber understory. Even though these are in the same county, they would have different regulations on the North Coast. And why is that? So you start digging into the California code a little bit, and essentially you have different rules based on different size of your projects. So the more smoke you're going to put in, the more regulatory compliance you have to do. So if you're doing projects under 10 acres or that are going to produce, piles that are going to produce less than 1 ton of particulate matter, again, that's the amount of smoke in the air, less than 1 ton, then you need to basically provide a map and an explanation of how long it's going to be burning, who the person is that's responsible, and then identify the sensitive receptors. That's it. Pretty easy. I mean, most air districts are going to have you do more than this, but legally by California code, this is the minimum. If you're going to get up to 100 acres or 10 tons of particulate, then you have to do the aforementioned things, as well as like identifying what your meteorological conditions are. Where do you want your wind to take that smoke? You need to also provide a more detailed map. You need to talk about the contingency. What are you going to do if something bad happens and your smoke misbehaves? And then go into detail about your public notification procedures. Are you going to call your local fire department and say, hey, there's going to be a lot of smoke. It's not a wildfire. Don't worry. These are all things that make sense, and they're all things that a good neighbor would do. But these are nice checklists to remind yourself, oh yeah, I do need to call the fire department. So that way they don't pull everybody away from their day jobs, have them climb into an engine and show up to my burn with sirens going and ruin their day and my day, because it could be as simple as a phone call to prevent those things. So at any rate, just some of the things outlined in code. And then basically the way the code's written, as I pointed out, is it's all based on particulate tonnage. So how many of those smoke particles you're sending into the air. But on most, and I use that word sparingly, most air districts, tonnage calculations are based on the amount of material you're hoping to burn. So this is an example from the North Coast again, on what you would submit with your smoke management plan, and it's based on the quantity of material you're burning. That said, there's a really handy calculator, and I don't understand exactly how it works, but there's a really handy calculator that you can get online to this Washington department and plug in. I suggest writing this email down and tagging it into your search engine at some point, saving it to bookmarks or whatever it is, meets your organizational strategy. But these are pretty handy because you can type in exactly what your pile is going to look like, the shape, the number, the size, the material. And then this will tell you, A, how many tons of material you have. And then based on the percentage of consumption, you think, like my pile is going to burn 80% and there's going to be some logs there, or it's going to burn 100%. It's going to be completely clean with no litter remaining. And then it kicks you out the amount of particulates you're going to send into the air. So if you can submit this with your smoke management plan, or even just with your air permit, it makes the folks at the air district's life a heck of a lot easier, because then you have all your boxes checked, and it's literally, it takes 5 minutes. It's not difficult and it's super handy. So that's the particulate side. And the other piece I want to point out is, like, as you're planning and thinking about burning and other things, we have burn days and then we have non-burn days. As I stated earlier, in terms of atmospheric stability and other things. But it's good to know that by 3:00 p.m. every day, the air district is basically required by code to share what its plan is for the next day. In worst case scenarios, the air district can decide to wait until 7:45 that morning. But if you look at this second line down in C, the code basically gives the air districts the ability to label things as marginal burn days. So there's burn days, go for it. We are sending our smoke to the moon. Don't worry about it. And then there's no burn days. Everybody's going to choke and die if we light anything on fire, right? And then there's these days in the middle, which is very, very common. We get these days in the middle. But what's the beauty part about that is that it allows the air districts to do things by a case-by-case basis, right? And as we're looking at those, basically each basin has their own set of rules, their own set of air specifics that they are required to check to say whether it's a burn day or not. So the South Coast Air Basin, as you can see, is fairly straightforward about the meteorological conditions that are required. And this is just the next one I clicked on, the North Coast Air Basin, North Central Coast Air Basin, gets pretty complicated. So much so that I wasn't able to screenshot all on one screen to put it in this slide. So the air districts themselves are playing by different rules in terms of weather for each of their regions across the state, which I find very fascinating. And I'm not entirely certain as to how these different conditions got selected, I guess, for each region. But it's interesting to know, and if you want to take the time to poke around and look at your own region, I find it very fascinating. So that being said, swinging back around to this PFIRS I mentioned earlier is the Prescribed Fire Information and Reporting System. And what this is super handy for is planning ahead on it's Wednesday. What am I going to do this weekend? Am I going to be able to burn, or should I plan on taking the family skiing or something instead, right? And what I like is you get basically a quick view for your region of what's the forecast looking like. Like, for example, that top line, Superior burn on January 11th, high confidence and favorable on the 12th, 13th, favorable, right? But you see where the red arrow is pointing and it says call the district. That's a marginal day. So that's a day when the air district, doesn't necessarily call it a no burn day, but they're saying, hey, we have some things we need to pay attention to, depending on your location, your size of your project and other things. Give us a call, let's talk about it. And when in doubt, call them. I can't say enough about how helpful it is to have a conversation with folks and really get an idea of what they're seeing and what they're forecasting in terms of weather. For example, this picture on the lower left is a burn I did last winter that it was on a no burn day actually. And I called the office and talked to our air quality folks and basically talked to Deb. She said, hey, Stackhouse, yeah, I understand that it's been dry and nice and your research plots are ready to go. She's like, but we're gonna have good dispersion from about 11:30 until 3:30 or something along those lines. And she said, I need your smoke dispersed before it shuts down and pushes everything to the basin at 4. And I was like, okay. So I went out there, got as much as I could done, not the whole project, but I got some of it done. And it dispersed nicely. And I was like, smokes, this is looking great, right? But then at 5 o'clock, I was leaving, and this is exactly what I saw was my smoke had lifted, spread out across the landscape, and then just as Deb predicted, at 5 o'clock, it went straight to the floor. But at that time, I was 15 miles away from the closest sensitive receptor. It wasn't a big deal. There was enough dispersion to where, you know, I called Deb and I said, hey, Deb, I'm sorry. I put quite a bit of smoke down. And she said, well, it looks okay from my end. So, you know, we were able to go forward and did some good work that day. And without the conversation and the staff there, we wouldn't have been able to get that project completed. So when in doubt, call your air quality staff because they're great. So this is my last slide. Quick summary is just really, when it comes to smoke management, it's all about just being a good neighbor. Like, because even when permits aren't required because of your project size or description, the federal EPA standards still say that nuisance smoke by one complaint is a problem, right? So as long as we don't have complaints and as long as we can be good about communicating and say the neighbor is having a wedding or something the day you want to burn, it's probably not the day you should be burning, right? Like just be a good neighbor. The other piece is for the larger projects, even if it's not required, like say you're doing 9.5 acres of a timber understory burn on the edge of town, maybe it's not required that you have a smoke management plan because it's only 9.5 acres, but you know, maybe it's a good idea to have a smoke management plan. When in doubt, I like to have smoke management plans because it helps me think through, am I being a good neighbor, right? And then as I mentioned in the last couple of slides is to check in with your air quality office because those folks are there. It's what they do for a living. They're incredibly knowledgeable and they want to help get these projects done because they know that they're benefiting our state and our ecosystem. So with that said, like clean ice, smoke is only a problem when it lands in the wrong place. So thanks a lot for listening and good luck burning out there.